and especially the relative weakness of Germany's hard power military capability compared to its economic influence in Europe. Much of this reflects the relatively low percentage terms defense spending of Germany, only about 1.2% of its gross domestic product, which in some ways means that its military capabilities are not quite as high as its geopolitical and diplomatic ambitions for leadership. A second factor has always been German public opinion. Even as the German foreign policy elite came to this conclusion that they needed to play a more active role in international security, the German public remained more skeptical, both about this role in general and about close partnership with the United States in particular. Already back in 2015, perhaps still influenced by the Eric Snowden revelations, an opinion poll by the Pew Center in the United States found, for example, that it was the Germans who had the largest numbers among European NATO allies who would be opposed to the use of military force if Russia invaded another NATO ally. 58% in the 2015 poll were actually opposed. Only about a third actively would support an Article 5 military response. The same poll found that in contrast to, say, France, where about 3 out of 4 French had a positive view of the United States, only about a quarter a negative view, in Germany it was almost evenly divided. About 50% said, yes, we think the United States is good, but 45% actually said, no, we have a negative view of the United States. And the most recent polling, again reflecting perhaps some of the attitudes towards President Trump in Germany, show that now only 35% have a positive view of the United States, and only around 10% have confidence in President Trump himself. So this German public opinion has not quite been in sync with the idea of partners in leadership. And last but not least is that even in the good times of the partnership and economic cooperation on TTIP, on some other fundamental economic issues, you had diametrically opposed policy approaches. In response to the global financial crisis, the Americans would be advocating austerity, more government spending and tax cuts to regenerate economic growth, while the Germans were arguing for exactly the opposite. Well, excuse me, the Americans were talking about stimulus, and the Germans were talking about austerity, balancing the budget, cutting expenditure, forcing even other European countries within the Eurozone, such as Greece, to get their budgets into balance. So this has sometimes been a tension, and we saw in the last weeks at the G7 meetings in Italy and the G20 meetings in Hamburg, this kind of trade tension between the United States and Germany, especially over Germany's large trade surplus, is something that President Trump is very concerned about and has labeled as very bad on behalf of the Germans. So looking forward, I think whether we can maintain or regain this kind of partners in leadership between Germany and the United States is a question about whether they can focus on those areas where they agree over those in which they disagree. President Trump's national security advisor, General McMaster, prior to the G20 meeting said that the US and Germany agree on 95% of the issues. It's just this 5% that ends up in the headlines. So focusing on the areas of agreement will be important. And it will also, I think, be important the extent to which the two countries continue to see each other as perhaps indispensable partners in leadership. The former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Maggie Thatcher, used to have this phrase, "there is no alternative." She was talking about market economics back in the 1980s, but perhaps it's true now in the 21st century that the United States and Germany, in fact, have at least few good alternatives to each other as partners. And so to the extent that they can maintain their domestic political and economic health, they may also be able to preserve this kind of relationship. So thanks for your attention. I turn next to Graeme Hurd.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt. So I'm trying to look at Brexit and its impact on German leadership, which is kind of speculative, but I'll give it my best shot. I'm more of a Russian specialist than Brexit and German or German-UK relations, but I'll try and outline some of the arguments that I'm putting into my book chapter for this book. So just to start with, Brexit is one of 4 systemic shocks that's created a revolution in thinking, strategic thinking, I think, in Germany over the last 3 years. It's revolutionized how Germany views its role, its national interests, and how best to achieve them. The first shock, 2014, was Crimea. Crimea was a shock because it questioned the settled, or the assumption, German assumption, that the post-Cold War order was settled in terms of norms. You had nuclear power changing international borders using coercive force, annexation Crimea, insurrection in Donbass. This was a big, big shock for Germany. Second shock was the 2015 migrant crisis, so 1.3 million migrants coming out of conflict zones into Germany. This questioned how the EU works, how Schengen works, responsibility and burden sharing within Schengen. So a different type of shock and a different set of questions it was posing. The third is Brexit in 2016. Brexit was a shock because it questioned the German working assumption that ever closer union and more EU is the solution to addressing, for example, transnational problems, not the problem itself. So the Britain leaving the EU questioned that fundamental assumption that Germany had. And then Brexit plus, as President Trump called what others have called Trumpquake, the US election. This questioned for Germany the twin pillars from a German and maybe wider European perspective of US primacy since the end of the Second World War had been alliance systems and free trade. And it wasn't clear, perhaps still is yet to be clarified, how President Trump would view the old foundations of a liberal international order, the free trade and alliance systems. Would we see, in effect, Pax Americana being reframed as Pax Trumpicana, in other words, a Trump vision or version of Pax Americana, in that alliances would be modernized and revitalized, and maybe free trade, multilateral trade deals would move to bilateral, but still protectionism wouldn't be in place? Or are we looking at Trumpocalypse, a different version, where alliance systems are undermined and we move to much more economic nationalism, protectionism, etc., etc. Anti-globalization, anti-EU, anti-migrant kind of worldview, amoral, transactional, zero-sum winners and losers, military-first approach. I'll put that out there. It's not quite clear where we are. The national security team around Trump certainly is Pax Americana, Pax Trumpicana, if you like, with a Trump face. President Trump himself, on different occasions, has said different things. But my contention would be, when it comes to Brexit in 2016, it shapes but doesn't determine German-Russian relations, German-Polish relations, and German-US relations. So it's a factor, but it's not a decisive factor. And this goes to the argument that even before Brexit, to answer Kissinger's question, who do you call when you call Europe, it was clear before Brexit even, you called the Chancellor's office in Berlin, you didn't call London. So the center of gravity, if you like, to go back to that Schwerpunkt idea of the political West, is really the Washington, D.C., Berlin link. And the UK is less significant and rather marginal to that. Having said that, from a UK perspective, perhaps this is wishful thinking, but from a UK perspective, Brexit represents a serious blow to the EU and to Europe. That Germany loses a key partner. In military power terms, the UK is probably the preeminent, one of the 2 nuclear powers, preeminent military powers within the EU, having the strongest links to the US, and 2% of its budget, one of 5 states, 2% of, GDP being spent on the military. In economic power terms, it's the 2nd largest EU budget contributor, and it's 12.8% of the EU's population, so that's a large market it represents. And politically, like Germany, the UK was kind of on side with Germany in terms of supporting free trade, supporting a reform agenda, supporting liberal values. And in soft power terms, the UK's strong diplomatic and intelligence networks were in place, the largest EU overseas aid and development contributor, and even English as the lingua franca. So this perception of the UK's perception of its centrality, if you like, and its power within the EU leads the UK to think it can have its cake and eat it. It can cherry pick and get the best deal possible from the EU. That BMW, looking at, for example, Britain as a car export market, will force Merkel's hand. It's really interesting, though, to listen to Dieter Kempf, who's the Federation of German Industries, the BDI's chair, and also Herr Kramer, who's the Confederation of German Employers Association, BDA, director. Both of them are saying that unless the Britain accepts all the 4 freedoms, there will be no deal. So if in other words, Britain's not able to cherry pick, and Merkel has essentially said that and what this really means is politics trumps economics. The integrity of the single market and protecting a single market of 27 other EU member states is much more important for Merkel and for Germany than the German car manufacturers' exports to the UK. And that's a clear point, I think. Some of the impacts, though, I think, of Brexit is to reinvigorate a Franco-German tandem within the EU. The fact that Marine Le Pen did not win the French election, which would have had an anti-EU, anti-globalization, anti-immigration head in France, would have been a severe, severe shock to Germany. And I think Germany realizes Brexit's bad, but if a Schengen zone and Eurozone, particularly a Eurozone country, left the EU, it would be even worse, 10 times as difficult. And so this fear, if you like, of a disintegration, of Nexit, Grexit, the Greeks leaving, Frexit, the French leaving, the Dutch leaving, I think focuses minds and determination between Paris and Berlin to make a Franco-German tandem, that's what's left really in terms of leadership, really work. So the focus now is on Franco-German visions of the economy, to what extent are they on side, and the UK is of marginal significance, I think, to that particular debate. So enhanced cooperation and development between Berlin and Paris is the key focus. What we're also seeing anyway, irrespective of Brexit, is the militarization or remilitarization of Germany as it moves towards, by 2024, 2% of its GDP. And in concrete terms, this means more frigates, more submarines, a cyber enhanced capability, a white paper they've put out, a Lithuanian battalion, etc., etc. Even the initiation of a nuclear debate in Germany. But I think you have a 10-year gap, really, before Germany can build the capabilities it needs to be able to have strategic autonomy, if it ever can have strategic autonomy. In other words, in an all-out war, US capability support for Germany doesn't shape, but it absolutely determines whether Germany survives or not. The US nuclear umbrella, absolutely critical. And Germany's ability to build the capabilities it needs to have strategic autonomy takes 10 years. So you have a 10-year gap. And in this particular period, I think the UK and the German-UK relationship is, in the military defense security sphere, is much more important. At least in the shorter term, the UK's role in that particular, not so much economic, but military sphere is important. And the UK's, in terms of the EU, the UK's anti-terrorism, counter-terrorism focus, counter-organized crime, etc. focus is also an area in which you could see partnership, continued partnership, hopefully, between Germany and the UK. So to conclude, in terms of leadership and the effect on leadership post-Brexit, I don't have any of the answers really, but I can maybe pose some of the key questions. For Germany, does it plug the funding gap that the EU, second largest contributor to the budget? Does Germany then say, okay, we're going to step up and with our big surpluses, we're going to plug that gap? Or does Germany say we have to reduce the scale, the scope, and the ambition of, for example, the European Defence Action Plan? We don't have as much money as we thought we were going to have, so we have to scale back. Or does Germany step up? That's one clear question. I'm not sure if there's an answer yet. Germany and France standing up to try and plug that gap. How does Germany manage its greater weight within a smaller EU? Is this a smaller but more coherent EU, but at the same time a less significant EU? Is Germany too big for Europe but too small for the world? It's like that album by Jethro Tull, Too Old for Rock and Roll, Too Young to Die. You know, caught in this twilight zone, trying to do one thing and failing on both, falling between two stools. How does Germany avoid an inner and outer EU core conception? How does it avoid the frustrations, the resentments, the suspicions even of a Greece or a Poland, for example, about German dominance? So how does it manage that? One way forward for Germany might be to, as Matt said, leading from the middle, leading from the center, trying to operate within the EU, within ad hoc, flexible coalitions on multiple kind of policy areas. And what you find is Germany would have a role, not necessarily leading every single issue, but in every coalition, on every policy issue, Germany is present. And Germany becomes the kind of organizing principle and the glue that holds EU policy making together. And this basically means Germany and Merkel having to find consensus, finding consensus within each of these policy areas. And in IR terms, international relations terms, maybe you talk about coalitional primacy. So primacy or leadership within coalitions as the way forward. But conceptually, I've yet to, I'm not reading an awful lot on this, but I've yet to really see debates that tackle how we conceptualize German leadership, clear German leadership. I think it's something that will emerge. It's maybe something that becomes apparent some months after we begin to see German behavior and look back and reflect on it. And it might be more by default, so German adopting a leadership role that kind of works in an ad hoc way, feeling its way forward, than any strategic blueprint that Germany has, master plan, if you like, of leadership. So it's kind of touchy-feely, as the Chinese would say, crossing the river by feeling the stones beneath your feet, rather than, I think that was probably Deng Xiaoping, his conception of the way forward. So on that happy note, I'll leave and pass on to Paul.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, Michał Baranowski has a television interview a little bit later this evening, so perhaps I suggest we start next with the Polish case, and then we'll come back to Paul and the Russian-German relations.
Thank you very much. It's fantastic to be here. It's good to join the Marshall family with a confusing name of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Some of my remarks will actually follow nicely. But Matt asked me to say a few words about Polish-German relationship, and it's obviously way too big, and everyone in this room has deep knowledge of the history, and I'm sure an opinion about as well. So I'm gonna try to do a quick run through some of the factors, and I think the question of how Germany's partners approach German leadership in Europe is really a big one, very much. I was also trying to think, since Matt, you had such a good byline for your summarizing the US-German relationship, what would be the byline for Poland? And it's not particularly deep, but it seemed to me like it's a good description would be a very tricky moment. To say the least. Poland and Germany, of course, has, we have thousands and thousands of years of history. Since we were before we were states, we had fights. After we Both countries became states. We had fights, but then, of course, the last 27 years has been a much more harmonious relationship. One number that I would sort of, in the historical perspective, bring is really the historical nature of Polish-German reconciliation. Really something that you can compare only to German-French reconciliation. So while in 1990s, 80 to 90% of Poles mistrusted Germany, according to public opinion polls, the balance has now flipped. And whether entirely despite of the government's policies, you still have a very high degree of trust between the nations. But we should really not talk about the historical side, because this would take us way too long. The factors that I would point out that drive now the relationship, which has become tricky, especially since the last parliamentary election, because some of the questions within the reconciliation dialogue have come back. So there are questions around pure interests. There are questions about the rise, and I'll jump to this, the rise of Germany as a leader in Europe, and some hesitancy that it creates, frankly, in Warsaw very much. And then there are the atmospherics, so to say. So the issues that are really focusing the debate